In today's session, we'll be covering conflict, and I'll be helping you to understand some of the key determining factors as to what causes conflict within our personal relationships, as well as some of the limiting beliefs we have and approaches that we take, which often exacerbate the situation rather than neutralise it. Now, language, although it may be classified as creative if you are a writer, novelist, or blogger, for example, is essentially a construct of our left-brain, rational reasoning mind, and thus we are limited in what we are able to convey or express via words alone. It's this restriction in itself which is enough to create conflict in our relationships. Plus, we've further complicated our use of language over the many thousands of years by developing thousands of different ways to communicate with each other, which only serves to further diversify us as a species and highlights the separation between us rather than focusing on our similarities. Now, even if you do speak the same language, there can still be instances where a person's accent is difficult to decipher, or they will use slang words, vocabulary or colloquialisms that you just don't understand. And when any kind of misunderstanding occurs in our communication for whatever reason, we can begin to see the other person as separate from us and we begin to disconnect. And these kind of miscommunications can leave us in awkward situations when we're travelling overseas. If we don't speak the language, it can be a barrier which can stop us from fully immersing ourselves in the culture due to fear or prejudice. But from the alternative perspective, as much as not understanding a particular language can be a barrier, you can also learn some very valuable lessons in how much communication actually happens without the presence or structure of words themselves. So on the subject of communication, how we communicate with each other isn't just about what's coming out of your mouth. It can also be non-verbal, such as body language, facial expressions, tone of voice or hand gestures, for example. This can also help to convey the message that you're trying to get across in face-to-face communication. We each develop our own communication style as we grow up, and this can be influenced primarily within our family unit, but it can also come from outside of our inner circle, especially from people we look up to in positions of power, and these can be teachers, politicians, sports personalities, or celebrities, for example. And the way that we learn to communicate is through learned behaviour, and as children we mimic and replicate those around us. And in the same way that we adopt our values from those around us as children, we also adopt the same conflict resolution styles as well. So if conflict happened on a regular basis whilst you were growing up, you're much more likely to attract it in your adult relationships too. And if your parents or carers struggle to effectively resolve arguments and miscommunications, there's a very good chance that this behaviour will also be perpetuated in your own relationships. And just to add a little bit more fuel to the fire, another compounding factor that we now face in our communication with others is that much of it occurs in the world of text, emails and instant messaging. As 70% of what we communicate is non-verbal and based on these other elements that we touched upon earlier, such as body language and tone of voice, we become heavily reliant on the words alone and the message that they are trying to convey. But without this much needed non-verbal aspect of how we speak to each other, our messages can then become misconstrued and we end up completely misunderstanding what the other person is actually trying to say to us. Now, because we all have instant access to social media, posting our opinions or thoughts before we have time to fully process how we feel about them, or if you're reacting to someone else's post, means that you can often say something that you will later regret. And we've all fallen prey to this, with celebs turning to Twitter and Instagram to air their dirty laundry, only to have to later retract their statement, head in hands. Taking the time to consider the impact your words could have on others is essential if you want to enjoy the benefits that social media can provide. When these kind of platforms are used to just vent your anger and frustration at the world, then you can run the risk of channeling that anger towards certain individuals and veering into the territory of the internet troll. So to understand what is happening under the surface when we feel the desire to react in this way, we need to address the subject of competition and how, on a very base level, what is really going on is a battle of the wills to dominate one another. Now, we've all experienced this kind of competitive conflict in our lives and the inevitable control dramas that this can create within our relationships. That feeling of either triumph over another person when you prove your point and win an argument or a debate, or at the other end of the conflict and the feeling of being completely deflated when someone gets one over on you. Now, what can start out as a simple difference of opinion can very quickly escalate into an argument if you feel that your identity is being threatened in some way. When we begin to identify who we are with what we believe in, when anyone then challenges those beliefs, it can feel as though they are threatening our very identity and who we are as a person. Now, powerful opinions and beliefs such as religion or politics can often generate powerful responses in people, and heated debates can then ensue. And what is essentially happening here is a struggle for dominance and a competition for energy, which will only ever result in a win-lose scenario with one party feeling victorious and the other feeling depleted. We can often get stuck in this kind of cyclical pattern, and this is why many people are stuck in toxic relationships. Now, this doesn't need to be on a romantic level. It can happen within families, friendships, and also working relationships as well. When disagreements occur in any conversation we are involved in, we can often fall into one of 4 base conflict archetypes. And whilst you may not be consciously aware of these personas, you will have seen them playing out on the global stage, especially on social media. Now, the first conflict archetype is the most aggressive of the 4, and this is the bully. Bullies can show up in our lives from an early age as parents, classmates at school, or even teachers. And this is anyone who can make you feel intimidated by their words or actions, and in some cases, even their mere presence. The second archetype is the interrogator, and these people love a debate. They will often use intellect to wear you down in an argument and question you constantly until you feel drained of all energy. You'll often find these folks embroiled in some kind of online diatribe. Now, the victim is someone who has usually suffered a lot in their lives, and because of this, they tend to naturally attract situations that place them in the victim role. These people are those who post about their sorrows on social media, and this is usually a virtual cry for help and a bid to connect with others who could possibly support them in their struggles. And finally, we have the aloof archetypes, who are often more naturally introverted people, and they will shy away from conflict and retreat into their shell. These people use silence to gain your attention, and they remove themselves from conflict by ignoring any pleas for a response or communication of any kind. Now, the single biggest mistake that we make when any kind of conflict occurs is by focusing on who is to blame. This can be highly disempowering in any relationship, but it doesn't necessarily need to involve another person. Blame, more often than not, begins with your own internal dialogue and can stem from many different sources. It's often born out of a set of expectations placed upon us by parents, peers, society, or religion, and this can engender feelings of guilt within us. Now, whether we are internalising blame on ourselves and regretting past actions and wishing that we could turn back the clock, or alternatively, if we are externalising it by apportioning blame outside of ourselves and directing it towards other people, the government, or corporations, for example, we must learn to recognise that blame is intrinsically linked to guilt and shame. For any blame that we put out there, we will attract the emotions of guilt and shame back to us, and this is a karmic law that we cannot get away from. These are the most disempowering emotions that we can feel as a person, so by reaching for blame every time we get stuck in life, we are literally draining our own energy. The only way that we can truly stand in our own power is to learn to accept that there is only ever so much we can change in any given situation. When we waste energy blaming things outside of our control, we end up damaging ourselves. So it all comes back to the mind, and as we've already covered, mindset is everything in how a person approaches life, and their attitude towards communication and the potential conflict that this can create is no different. Applying the idea of a growth mindset in our communication means that we must begin to ask, what can I do better? What is this person trying to say to me? Is there a better way to communicate or approach this situation or conversation than I'm having right now? So, if a person is fixed in their beliefs, this creates a fixed mindset, and this can in turn create a huge amount of conflict both internally within that person and externally within their relationships. This kind of mindset also tends to create an inflexible attitude towards life and can lead a person to always feel at odds with the world in some way. For us to be able to effectively resolve conflict in our relationships, we must first work on resolving the conflict within our own minds and hearts. And to do this, we must nurture a growth mindset and always be asking, is there a better way? So it's time for today's exercise. So I want you to take out your journal as we begin to make content that we covered in today's session meaningful to your own life. So firstly, I'd like you to reflect on any recent conflict that you've had in your life. Now this could be a phone call, a post that you reacted to on social media, or an argument or a debate with a friend or loved one, for example. I want you to write down what happened and detail as much as you possibly can. I also want you to write down how you felt during the conflict, but also how did you feel afterwards? Now, were you able to resolve the conflict? And if so, how did you go about this? And then when it comes to conflict in general, do you identify with any of the archetypes that we discussed in today's session? You may recognise elements of the bully, the interrogator, victim, or the aloof in your own personality. Now, we can fall into any of these roles, so you may relate to more than one, and that's perfectly normal. Now, conflict can be a huge cause of stress in our lives, and in the next session, we'll be focusing upon this very subject, and I'll be sharing with you the devastating impact that stress can have on our health, and highlighting all of the triggers that can cause it in our daily lives. As always, if you feel like sharing your thoughts or views from this session with the group, then remember you can do so by heading to Facebook and discussing and reflecting upon this with others in the group.